Welcome to the talk show Life Stories with Marc Hoberman. The goal of this show is to provide a learning experience to people of all ages, with guests from various fields in academics, a wide range of industries, and insight into the many forms of art, athletics, and entertainment. We hope you enjoy the show. Rod Argent of the Zombies and Argent is today's special guest. Rod will talk about his beginnings in the music business, some of his favorite musicians, and still performing on stage after almost 60 years.
Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee, Rod Argent. Welcome back to Life Stories with Marc Hoberman.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure.
So great to have you again. You know, I had the honor, as you know, of interviewing you and Colin a few months ago, so I'm so happy to get this alone time, this one-on-one time with the great Rod Argent. You know, Rod, although many people believe that our fate is written in the stars, did you always believe your fate was to be a music legend or a musician to begin with?
Well, I never thought that was necessarily my fate, but I always wanted it to be my fate because music was always the place where I felt at home. Even from being, you know, sort of 7 years old, it was, I always related to the John Lennon comment when he said, music to me was the real world, and what other people regarded as being the real world was, to me, you know, sort of peripheral. But music was really where I felt at home. And it's the place that even if I didn't understand everything I was listening to, if I was hearing something for the first time, I remember I was in a choir as a kid, as a boy, treble, in a cathedral choir, a really good cathedral choir. And the new organist and master of the music, who was only 26 at the time, became later one of the foremost Bach organists in the world. Really enthusiastic guy. He put a performance of the Bach St. Matthew Passion on. Now I was about 12 at the time, and still a treble, before my voice broke. And it's the first time I'd heard a serious piece of Bach, and he mounted St. Matthew Passion. And I remember the first chorus, when I was singing the first chorus of it, I just melted in a full church. I just absolutely melted. And I thought, this is just how music should be. And it wasn't the total of what I wanted to hear. I mean, I was just as knocked out. I just heard at that time, about a year before, I'd been introduced to Elvis singing Hound Dog. And that turned my whole world around. And that introduced me to people like Little Richard, and all the great early rockers, all that huge energy. And what I always thought was black music by proxy in my mind, because it led me very quickly into listening to Big Mama Thornton, who was the first recorder of Hound Dog, and very quickly into other areas like some of the old blues artists in America and Ray Charles, etc., etc. And also at the same time, I'd heard the early Miles Davis post-bop group before kind of Blue with John Coltrane, Cannonball Adderley, and I was knocked out with that too. And it all felt like water from the same well for me. And always each sort of music was just another way of expressing something which really touched me and made me feel at home. So I never wanted to be anything else. I never thought, I never knew if it would ever be possible. And at one time, the only thing I was any good at school, academically, was English. I used to sort of come top of the year in English, but everything else, I was pretty much at the bottom of the year, right, or there or thereabouts. So I thought that my fate might be, and I wasn't necessarily looking down on that, something to do with writing or studying English, or I might end up being an English teacher or something. I don't know. But I didn't want that to happen. What I wanted to be was something in this world which felt so real to me. And so I didn't think it was written in the stars, but it was something I always wanted to be written in the stars. And I'm so happy that I've managed to earn a great living all my life out of practicing what I've always loved to do.
Oh, sure. And the reason I use the term fate, because in the stars, is that the last time we spoke, you mentioned Shakespeare, and then you mentioned liking English. And of course, in Romeo and Juliet, what was their fate to the beginning? You know, were they destined for what the ending was? And I asked that because I don't know if people realize when they say, oh, the zombies have been together a long time. So when I see pictures of people, I'm really good with faces, and they say, oh, look at this guy in high school who's now, and I can always get it. But you guys looked really different when I see pictures of you. But people don't realize this could be your 60th year as friends, 60th year kind of making music together. I think that was fated in the stars. So how did that come about? Because you didn't meet him at a gig at 27 or 35. How did that come about? You were kids. You were teenagers.
We were so young. I mean, it was extraordinary. I remember I may have said, I apologize if I've said some of these things to you before.
No, not at all.
But I remember seeing Elvis, first of all, when I was 11 years old, when I heard Hound Dog, because my cousin Jim Rodford, who later was bass player with the Kinks on some of their biggest selling records, he was 4 years older than me. And he said, he played me Elvis, and it just turned my world around totally. And about a few weeks after that, I saw on a UK BBC television news clip, a little clip of Elvis singing in America. And it seemed like a world that was so far away culturally from what England was at the time. It was, you can hardly imagine it. It was really, really a different world. And America and England stayed that far apart culturally for a long time. And I remember even in 1964, which was literally only 8 years later, we went to play our first gig in America with a #1 record that we had, which was #1 in Cashbox, She's Not There, and which I later learned, and I apologize again if I said this before, because it made such an impression on me, that Elvis actually had 3 of my songs and our records on his jukebox. And that was just 8 years later, from looking at this supernatural being from a world that seemed as if it was in another galaxy. And I remember being over in New York and looking at the cars. And if you can imagine what the cars were like in 64, still, even after the 50s, those wonderful, wonderful American cars that were as big as boats, but looked like mobile jukeboxes in my mind. So different to anything you would ever see in the UK. And the level of energy in New York at that time as to what you would experience in the UK was absolutely unbelievably different. I mean, things are much more homogenous now. Right. Things are much, much more, you see the same cars everywhere. Not quite, but, just pretty much. There are just 1 or 2 places in the world, maybe China, maybe Japan has very much its own feeling when you're in Tokyo. But, generally speaking, the world has become much more homogenous. In those days, it was unbelievably different. And I never thought that the whole, my whole career could necessarily start like that. But we were so young, you're right. We were 18, 5 skinny white kids at 18 going to play with some of the black legends in the US. And them accepting us, which was just wonderful. And this was like a dream. I mean, can you imagine being 18? We were like all heterosexual guys, and the girls were going crazy about us. What a wonderful, what a dream. You didn't even have to try. That's right. It was just lovely. And being involved with our passion, which was music, and we were such great friends. And we all stayed great friends all our lives. I think we're almost unique in that. I can't think of another band that stayed so friendly throughout the whole time with no bust-ups. It's been great, actually. And when we occasionally get together now, the original band, or the ones that are left, because dear Paul kicked the bucket in early 2000s, which is very, very sad. But we still get on like a house on fire, and that's so unusual. And I can't really explain it, why that is, but it's been a gift.
It certainly has, and you've obviously been a gift to us. But I was interviewing a very accomplished bass player, Jerry Jamot, recently, and he was telling me about all the people he's played with. And I love the fact that you're not just unto yourselves. People don't realize that there is this community of musicians that play together, that respect each other. So you talk about, listening to Elvis, and that really got your creative juices flowing. But what people have you played with and you really look up to? Because again, for Rod Argent to look up to anybody is no small task. But who really floats your boat, for lack of a better term, musically through the years that you either worked with or you still listen to?
Oh, well, I mean, even now, I never tire of listening to the early Ray Charles. One of the earliest albums I ever bought was Ray Charles in person, 1959, Atlanta, Georgia. And it was recorded with one mic, a DJ put one mic in the auditorium. The sound is still exceptional. It sounds wonderful, wonderfully balanced. And the soul in that record, it just knocked me out at the time. I'd never heard anything like it. It was so slow. I'd heard his version because I'd already heard a few things by Ray Charles, and I'd heard "Drown in My Own Tears," and the version that I'd heard was the original version he made, which was sort of "It brings a tear," about that tempo. I put on this album, and this was before we were professional. I was still living at home, and I used to go home each night. And when my parents had gone to bed, I put the vinyl onto our old radiogram, which was what it was called. Actually, spanking brand new at the time, but that's what it was. And lie on the floor and listen to this. And I remember the first time I put it on, and it started like this. It brings a tear. Boom, 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 boom. Live. And it was so soulful and it was so slow that by the time it got to the chorus, and I'd never heard the Raelettes before at that point, not in this way, suddenly they came in with the chorus. It was about 10 minutes after the original song started. And I used to just, give me goosebumps, honestly. And so I still never tire of that very early period of Ray Charles. Things like Hard Times, Who Knows Better Than I. Sticks and Stones, his follow-up to What I Say, which is still brilliant. And we used to do it at the time, and I think we do a better version of it now. It's those things I've always loved. I love those early people like Little Richard, which, you hear something like Lucille, right, or Tutti Frutti. And the energy in that, and the basic soul in that, which all comes from gospel, I guess, really, and the black churches and everything, of course, but, which we had no part of and we weren't part of. But it's just wonderful to hear, and Aretha, and all those early things. But those things, but from a personal point of view, when playing with people like Pete Townsend, he had huge energy and focus in his playing. And very, very bright and marvelous composer and musician. And what else? When I played on the Ringo Starr All-Star Tour, it was a dream to play with Ringo because the Beatles were gods to us. I mean, when they started, and almost every other musician in the UK in a rock and roll context, it was 1962. And when he asked me to be in the Ringo Starr All-Star Band in 2006, it was just actually playing with him, his groove, because he was a slightly more old-fashioned drummer in the sense that he was a few years older than me, 6 years older than me, I think. So he was coming up in the time before the whole rock and roll beat boom, really, that had sort of what we call straight eights, with a feeling of rhythm, rather than the two things sort of overlapped each other for a while, and I think Charlie Watts was another guy who had that, where it sounds very simple, his playing, but his groove is beautiful because and just what's needed all the time, because it's got this slight swing about it that you can hardly put your finger on, but it's lovely, and it was great playing with him. He used to let me do a really extended solo on Hold Your Head Up when I toured with him. And sometimes the groove that was going on behind when I was playing, I just played longer and longer and longer. And you'd look round and he'd be smiling, and he loved it. He absolutely loved it. And I remember one night after I finished the solo, he came up and said, "It's the same every night." He said, "It's just as good as this every night." It's so sweet of him to say. And so things like that were a dream come true for me. But I played with a jazz legend in the UK called John Dankworth. There was John Dankworth and Cleo Lane. Cleo Lane became very popular, certainly on the east coast of New York, of America, sorry. And she used to get bouquets of flowers from Ella Fitzgerald, when she played at Carnegie Hall and things like that. John was a legend over here in an English way. He was one of the generation of English musicians that were blown away with Charlie Parker, and spread the gospel about Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker said of John that he was his favorite alto sax player outside of America, and he borrowed his horn a couple of times, when he was playing. And John became a great friend. I played a lot with him. And that was a joy to me. So that's someone that's slightly unexpected, maybe. I remember playing on the same bill with Chick Corea. I loved Chick's playing, absolutely wonderful. The person that so sadly now had a stroke, Keith Jarrett, is one of the best players I've ever heard in my life. When you pick the live concerts, if you go to YouTube and look up the Town Hall concert, that's something that blows me away. When he plays All the Things You Are on the Town Hall concert, ridiculously fast but wonderfully musical. And a guy also that recorded a lot of solo Bach for ECM. I just love that. I love people whose world embraces many different genres of music, and they can get, because it's and more than you would ever think that happens. But anyway, we were topping the bill in a Spanish festival, and he came along to our midday sound check, and we were just way down on the bill when this incarnation of the Zombies had just started again, and Colin and I were playing together again. And he came up and introduced himself to us afterwards. And I said, "Oh, it's great to meet you." And he said, "Well, Colin's version of Misty Roses, the Tim Hardin song, which was done with a string quartet on Colin's album 1 Year, he said, it's my favorite piece of music of all time." And this is a guy who was so much heavier and, more raucous in the way people regard him. But so many musicians embrace so many styles of music, and their fans would be stuck in one rut very often. But they would always listen to so much and so many different genres. And I love that. And musicians were much more Catholic in their tastes, I think, or are, than many people ever realize. And I love that. I love that universality. And when I played with the initial weather report rhythm section, when I did my first solo concerts after after Argent first split up, and I played with Alphonso Johnson on bass and Chester Thompson on drums, and after that, Alphonso at one point said, "Look, I'd love to produce you," but it never happened. But we stayed writing Christmas cards to each other for many years after that, and these alliances and this mutual respect actually provides a way of communication, which you don't have to work at all the time. It's just there all the time, and it's really lovely. It's a world of its own.
Yeah, there's so many phenomenal names that you just dropped, the best in the business. So, and you talk about all these other bands, but, I always wanted to ask you, there are so many successful bands that break up. You said this earlier, hard feelings, sometimes there's no reconciliations. So how did it come about when you first decided to leave the Zombies and start Argent? There was no fight, there was no argument. So what was it made you guys sit down and say, I know I'm Rod Argent and it's time for me to do my own thing? How did that come about?
Well, it came about really because if we hadn't been ripped off so badly by our management, which meant that from a live point of view, we never did anything but break even though we had number one records in many places in the world, and we headlined tours sometimes. We never lost money, but we only ever broke even. And we later found out there was a lot of ripping off going on, as there was with many bands. I mean, most agents and managers were of a previous generation, and they thought rock and roll was something which was going to last for about 5 or 6 years, and that's it. And so they better fleece everyone for as much money as they could while they could. Whereas the ridiculous thing is, it's lasted longer than any other form of popular music. It's absolutely ridiculous. But it got to the point where Chris and I, as writers in the Zombies, were absolutely fine because we had an honest publisher, which was very unusual in itself at the time. And the publishers paid us exactly what we were due. And in those days, you didn't often know where you had hit records because the world didn't communicate in the same way as it does now. And so it would be months later that the money would come in. But it always came in for Chris and me. But the other guys in the band who didn't write, they just had no money. So that's why we split up. And that's why we recorded Odyssey and Oracle, because when it looked as if we might be splitting up, Chris and I said, we've got to get our own ideas on how our songs should sound onto record before we split up. Because even if no one ever hears it, it'll be there in the ether. It'll stay there, you know. And we did. And for the first time for years, our records were sounding, our songs at least were sounding very close to the way they sounded in our heads when we wrote them. And the whole band loved the album, loved the experience of recording the album, thought it was the best we could do. But because we were based so much in the UK at the time, and we'd only ever really had one hit single up to that point for many reasons, which I won't go into now. A lot to do with management again. And it meant that Chris and I wanted to stay in the business. We broke up. And then, of course, we had that belated number one in Cashbox with Time of the Season in America, which incidentally came out. It was actually number one in the Cashbox edition that was published 50 years to the day before we performed on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and got inducted, which was an extraordinary coincidence. But again, you know, lovely in itself. So we always stayed friends. We didn't break up through any acrimony. We just broke up because of necessity, really. And Chris wanted to stop playing at that point, but he wanted to carry on as producer. He wanted to carry on working with me. And we wrote together for quite some time with Argent and had a great friendship, which lasts to this day, actually. I last spoke to him about 3 days ago. And Chris is even older than me, you know, and we've been so lucky. We've had a career in music, you know, up to the age of, I mean, I'm 79, Colin and I are 79 this year. And yet we still go out and we still have a ball sometimes playing concerts, and we still relate to younger people. That we almost always have a young component in the audience along with everybody else, and they come back and they say, we absolutely love your stuff, and they even know the words to the new songs that we put out. I mean that was unlooked for when we started. We never thought that would happen in a million years, and the fact that it has is something which gives you such a lovely feeling that a song that you might have written when you were the same age as the person who is talking to you and saying, oh, I love that. I absolutely love that song. I heard it in this film or whatever it was. And it really moves me, you know, and I've only just heard it. And you think, wow, you know, it's because it was done for real. It was because it wasn't done to try and be commercial, although God knows we wanted to be successful and we wanted to make lots of money, but that was never the reason that we did things. It was never the engine that drove us to do things. We always wanted to get through life and as much as possible say, well, we might not have made everything work, but we gave it our best shot. We did what we could. And that's the way I still feel. And because we still do it for real, it can still be very satisfying.
I can tell you, I've seen you 25 times. There is no less energy when I saw you 25 years ago. I wonder what's going on over there. So just amazing stuff. So Rod Argent of the Zombies and Argent, thank you again for joining us today, sharing so many great moments, musical memories. I just want to say quickly to the viewers, don't forget to watch us on E360 TV, available on Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. EST, available on Roku and Apple Fire, Apple TV. Remember to follow us on social media. Life Stories with Marc Hoberman is on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and of course our YouTube channel. So remember to subscribe. Rod Argent, lightning does indeed strike twice. Interviewing again a second time. What an honor. Thank you so much for being a guest on my show again.
Oh, great pleasure, Mark. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Life Stories with Marc Hoberman. To contact Marc, email him at info@lifestorieswithmarchoberman.com or visit him on social media through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn. Thank you for watching Life Stories with Marc Hoberman.